Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar on the Queer Migrant Project. My name is Kate Scanlon, and I'm one of the Capacity Building Coordinators with Community Legal Centres Queensland. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's webinar here in Brisbane, Mianjin, and acknowledge that these are they are the Turrbal and Yagara people, and I wish to pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge these are stolen lands and sovereignty was never ceded. As this webinar is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, I'd also like to acknowledge um, the traditional owners of the lands for which you're also joining us from, as well as any First Nations people joining us today. Today, we're pleased to welcome Mark Klein from LGBTI Legal Service, who'll be talking to us about the Queer Migrant Project that was established in 2024. I'll let Mark tell you a bit more about themselves when I hand over in a moment. But before I do that, some quick housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll have the recording available to download later today. We encourage you to ask questions. If you have a question for Mark, please go down to your control panel and there should be a question and answer box. Pop it in there and then we'll save all the questions until the end. But for now, I'll hand over to Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Kate. Hello, my name is Mark. My pronouns are he, she, they. Thank you, everyone who could make it today. But before I introduce myself and this work properly, I also would like to pay deepest respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands in which we work and live. We recognise their continuing connection to land, water, and culture, acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander LGBTIQ+ sister girls and brother boys community, and recognise the ongoing battle for visibility and inclusivity. We also pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge the wisdom, strength, and truth-telling of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we are committed to fostering a culture of shared knowledge and learnings with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people accessing justice. So today I'll briefly go through the Queer Migrant Project, and I've just done up a very quick outline just to give an overview of what I'll be trying to cover today. 50 minutes is a very short space of time to cover a project of this size, so I encourage any of you to reach out to me or consult the Safer Practice guideline that we developed from the project after the presentation, and I'll be giving a QR code near the end of the slideshow for you to access the electronic version of. But in summary, I am introducing the Queer Migrant Project. It was established by LGBTI Legal Service in 2024. It aims to highlight the voices of LGBTQ+ people from migrant backgrounds in the context of domestic and family violence in Queensland. So in other words, it addresses the three intersections of LGBTQ+ or queer, the intersection of migrant, and the intersection of those in the context of domestic and family violence. So specifically, the project seeks to identify gaps and opportunities for developing new and existing approaches and expertise that responds to this intersection and hopefully drive systemic change for culturally safer and more inclusive DFE supports in Queensland. This means that the project applies to many practitioners and organizations and projects that support those who are in these three intersections, including legal practices, CLCs, social workers, domestic family violence specialist supports, counselors, medical professionals, just to name a few. And also just on that point, I just want to emphasize that this project's paramount goal is to act as a stepping stone or one part of a puzzle that is driving systemic change for culturally safer and more inclusive supports addressing DV in Queensland. It is by no means a comprehensive project, if there is ever one, or something that claims some kind of maybe preeminent authority on the topics that I'll be covering today. Its findings and recommendations are meant to be a guideline for practitioners to work on and consider. So a little bit about my service. So LGBTI Legal Service is a community legal centre based in West End, Miganjin, or Brisbane. It dedicates its support to it dedicates its services to legal support of the LGBTQ plus community across Queensland. And it also has a very important section focused on policy and law reform, where projects such as the Queer Migrant Project are nurtured. Also want to introduce myself and my co-leads of the project. My other two co-leads are not here today, so I'll be speaking on behalf of them. To our left, we have Sina, who is of Persian ancestry, has come here as a refugee and currently works with QPAST in Brisbane, and they coordinate with our partner organisation, Third Queer Culture. The one in the middle, Dilsa, is a queer community worker and artist from Sri Lanka. They were trafficked as a child and grew up in Switzerland and in France. They are an intersectional feminist with experience and keen interest in domestic violence for those of our cohort. And then there's me. So I was born in Sunnybank, Queensland. I grew up most of my life in Logan City. My mother is from the Philippines, specifically Mindanao, and specifically she is an Ilocano. And my father emigrated to Australia in the early 60s from Germany, and his heritage is Saxon. I am also queer. I am camp. I am non-binary, and I am also an artist. And my artworks specifically speak to lived experience as a person of mixed Filipino descent and what it means to be queer and racialized. And of course, I'm also a worker at LGBTI Legal Service and co-lead of the Queer Migrant Project. So I guess to just really begin at the where this project began and the kind of discussions that fostered this project and why it came about, I'll spend maybe 5 or so minutes on some of the background or the context to how this first came about. I guess the push to do the Queer Migrant Project was around dialogue already happening for some time around marginalized communities, and specifically when speaking about domestic and family violence, and how these sort of experiences and this kind of dialogue is complicated by queerness or the identity of LGBTQ plus. So from these sort of discussions, the project finally crystallized in early 2024 when it was pitched. Now, some of the dialogue that was going around or that I was part of, and either in the service or beyond, was speaking particularly on four things. So representation, visibility, language, and the need for peer-led projects. So in the service, for example, we were discussing identities that spoke to queerness or third or non-binary gender around the world, and that these identities didn't neatly fit into what constructs of gender were in the West. So some of these third or non-binary genders, including Two-Spirit or Bakla in the Philippines, for example. So we was talking about how in CLCs or in organizations or in reports that these identities weren't necessarily captured a lot um, and this sort of thing, this sort of discussion produced dialogue of how this may be an issue, maybe when identifying and then assisting queer migrants experiencing domestic violence. But it also opened up broader questions that speaks to the role of support services. For example, are we asking the right questions? Or should we have more terms in our intake forms about or that identify queer migrants? Or maybe it's how we ask them. Or is it about how we represent ourselves as a service? Like, for example, do queer migrants or people with these three intersections feel comfortable approaching us for help? So these sort of questions were part of the dialogue that pushed the Queer Migrant Project. As for visibility, relatedly, there was discussion about how this cohort finds services like this, noting particularly cultural and language barriers. For example, what if a queer migrant experiencing domestic violence doesn't know or can't connect with support services for whatever reason, especially in terms of intersectional experience of being queer and also being a migrant in this country. As for language, relatedly again, some things that we were talking about were interpreters and how that might be really needed, especially when it comes to those in certain degrees of English. But it's a little bit deeper than that. an example of what I'm talking about is the use of specific terms such as the acronym LGBTQI+, as mentioned. It doesn't suit everybody or may even have or evoke difficult responses. And as we'll see in the project itself, terms such as victim survivor or terms that we often find in discourses about domestic violence may be problematic to this cohort. And, the word violence or even the phrase domestic and family violence, it can be, very broadly interpreted or not widely understood in terms of maybe the legal connotations of those terms. So we were also talking about how language maybe could be improved to be more accessible. And we also talked about the need for peer-led projects. So if we were going to make a project like this, it would have to be peer-led. That is, it will be a project produced and guided by people from the three intersections. And as some of us might understand, this would be better suited to center the voices of the participants rather than fit them into preconceived frameworks or trying to tick boxes for statistics, which, as noted, may be contributing to queer migrants not showing up to services in the first place. So I just also want to just very briefly mention some of the reports or research that went into this project. So, for example, there were several identified needs coming out in reports. We particularly looked at the National Action Plan. There are also several reports from ANROS that we consulted. And we also had an ongoing discussion with QPAST, which would become a partner in this project. And in particular, there was a consensus around how workers in these organizations were highlighting the need for more cultural capacity when it comes to supporting people of these three intersections, that is, those who are queer and LGBTQ+. So I also just want to talk a little bit about the partners or the supporters of this project. As I mentioned, Three Queer Culture is a peer social group here in Miganjan. They provide community support and as well as opportunity for friendships and belonging for those who, particularly those who are refugees or asylum seekers coming here to Brisbane. We also got quite a bit of support from Queer and Trans Workers Against Violence, or QD-WAVE. Potentially some of you may know this cohort. So they were able to assist us on some of the things that we consulted them for, such as the creation of information or guidelines. They were particularly helpful to us. Also, I haven't put in the slide, we did consult Clayton Utz for legal help around the guidelines and terms of engagement, and also consulted several professionals throughout the project, particularly those related to domestic violence and those who specifically interested in the needs of immigrants to Australia. So this is just some information about Third Queer Culture and some contact information there at the bottom if that interests you to look at later. So how did QMP or Queer Migrant Project take form? So I'll talk a little bit about the process or the method or some of the frameworks that we employed for this work. So firstly, when we made the application to Queensland Government, we applied to the Safe and Diverse Communities Grant, which is specifically for community-led projects to increase capability of culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and in order to recognize, respond to, and prevent DV across Queensland. So that was the funding behind the project. We also, a very major part of this project was the need for it to be peer-led, and the main way that we did that was to recruit what we called a peer advisory group, or a PAG for short. So they were a group of LGBTQ plus people who were asylum seekers, refugees, immigrants, or people with migrant backgrounds, with basically two criteria. They either worked with people who experienced domestic and family violence and have lived experience of domestic and family violence, although in practice, it was mostly the second criteria that we recruited from. Now, in regards to recruitment, we understood the need for a diverse cohort wherever possible and balanced this with who responded to our call outs, for example. We got a fair few who responded and who participated in other projects that we were working on, for example, Justice Beyond the Binary. We ended up having quite a good number of Farsi speaking members joining, given our close connection with Third Queer Culture and our Persian co-facilitator, Sina, which itself kickstarted an insightful exploration about interpreting for queer migrants, which I'll get to soon. But we also recruited on the basis of the need for in-person engagement. And this was agreed to best capture the information firsthand and to facilitate the kinds of activities that we were planning to engage with them. Yeah, so it also was a means of speaking to the many limits that we experience in this project, such as location and time being the most present. So that was a decision that we made at the start of the project. Um, this was an example of one of the call-outs that we went and published via social media as well as our website. We also sent this information out to our networks through emails. Also, word of mouth was used quite a lot, and basically sending through to our friends and colleagues this information to join us for a Q&A and see if this might be something that you're interested in joining later on in the year. So also an important part of the project was our project facilitators. So yeah, as you can see, Sina, Dilsa, and myself on the right. And basically, in the spirit of being peer-led, we also come from, or we are also people who identify with the three intersections of being queer, being migrant, and having had lived experience of domestic and family violence. So that we were, sorry, responsible for facilitating the project, for guiding the project, and for collecting all the information and presenting it. So that's about that. So the way that we engaged the peer advisory group, it basically took two forms. There was in-person workshops, as well as shorter online meetings facilitated by each facilitator. We were to basically the reason why we did this was to give opportunities to share in a more intimate and hands-off context when we're talking about the online meetings, as well as to maximize information sharing and connection. However, it's important to note that the main consultation we did was through the in-person workshops, and the online meetings were, as you may an additional part or a part that built off the work that we did in the in-person workshops. So mainly it was the in-person workshops where we did mainly the main consultation, and the online meetings where we further discussed it in smaller groups. Now, some of the topics, or all of the topics here that we covered through 5 workshops, at the very start, it was very important for us to focus on relationship building and coming to a model of engagement. So just given some privacy, I won't be able to share too much on this point, but we ended up coming to a consent-based model of sharing that everyone expressed agreements of, and which governed how we went ahead with the project. As I said, this is really important for us to maximize safety and address any concerns that the participants had as to privacy. We do note that some of the members were not out. So, and what I mean by out is that they were not fully showing their identities to broader members of the community. So it was essential for us to get consent and to do so safely with the information shared in and to present that information in a de-identified way. So that was a significant part of this. Also, as for the rest of the topics, they all related to domestic and family violence as well as to the cohort we were addressing. The workshop 2, we spoke more about domestic and family violence, what it meant in a legal context, but also very importantly, what it meant to them, and that would and did create quite a lot of interesting discussion about their perspectives of what violence is and how they felt they could report on it, for example. And we also spent some time talking about services that they had experienced. As for workshop 3, we dedicated that time to reviewing some fact sheets or resources that were publicly available from several organizations in Queensland related to domestic and family violence. And we started working on what would become a safer practice guideline, which would basically, at the end of the project, collate all the findings into a comprehensive whole. The last 2 workshops were dedicated to preparing information for a forum, which we did at the end of the project, as well as finalizing the manual, as well as evaluating and feedback, which we consulted on as well. So some of the activities that we did during the peer advisor group consultations, it wasn't just discussions on those topics. We also had many interactive activities, and that helped us bridge and connect and build friendships with each other. Now, we had activities such as check-ins. We did at the start of every workshop. For example, how's your weather? We ended up using that as a kind of metaphor for our feelings, as a way of expressing ourselves without needing to divulge what was going on. We also did some physical activities, such as passing a ball of yarn while holding it onto a string. And we did this at the start of the project, as well as right at the end, as a kind of sentimental and symbolic act of empowerment and community building. We also did meditations for grounding and to give us some space to give us the headspace to engage with each other. And really interestingly, we did quite a lot of creative expressions, a lot of artistic ways of addressing the topics. Our favorite one was what we called recipes, which is a metaphor of, well, we used recipe as a metaphor for what are the ingredients or what are the things that make up a safe practice or what make up how they want to be treated when they go to services for support on DV. And some of these creative expressions are really interesting. These are 2 of my favorites. So the one on the left was done by a Farsi speaker. I can't read Farsi, but um, some of these were really beautiful and really spoke to, another way of seeing what this cohort needed in terms of safety from services. Some of them, we did this as a way as to try and get out of English and using other ways of expressing and communicating. And the results of that were very beautiful and very empowering. So these show up a lot in the manual, which I'll be sharing near the end of the presentation. So I encourage you to have a look at these in particular. Um, Also during the consultations, also, in addition to topics and creative expressions and all these activities, we also introduce definitions that permeate in the discourse of domestic and family violence, as well as this cohort of queer migrants. And trying to get this how they feel about these terms and what are their perspectives of it and which terms, and I guess that helped us navigate which terms we'd be using for this work in the future, as well as what we should be putting in the manual at the end. So also the way we note took was also consent formed, was consent based, sorry. Basically, the facilitators would take notes. Either myself or another staff member would be helping us. And that was a way to maximize the capture of the information. And those notes were collated and sent to the participants for feedback. And we edited those notes accordingly, according to their wishes. It was also really important to pay attention to the safety of our participants, especially in the context of domestic and family violence, as we can all appreciate. It that had the potential of, you know, showing quite traumatic experiences with each other. So we had a member from QPAST at hand to provide ongoing counselling and support during the workshops if that was needed. And if they weren't present, Sina was also available to connect whoever needed it to any counselling support. So also really importantly, now that I'm on Sina, a very important part of the project was the use of interpreters. Now, I'll just quote exactly what Sina has said for me to say. So, at first, we hadn't planned for interpreters, and there was some hesitation because of previous negative experiences. To address this, we brought in 2 interpreters and created a new model, mini 1-hour workshops before each session, where Sina would check in with them and discuss the day's work. And these sessions focused on trauma-informed practice, inclusion, and building connection. This allowed participants to feel safer, supported, and fully part of the group alongside others who didn't require interpreting. So that was a direct quote from Sina there about the importance of interpreters to the project. Now it's nearly 1:30, so I am on time. I am going to talk now about some of the findings. I'll try to get through as many of them as possible with you today. Obviously, given the time, I'm not going to be able to spend too much time really fleshing out each of these issues and the recommendations. However, I do encourage you to read the manual at the end of this presentation, which will provide a lot more detail than I'm going to provide today. So I'll just first, yeah, I basically said that. So the first uh, uh, main issue, which we identified, was the need for more intersectionality in service providers of domestic family violence. So, as you can see, a common complaint from the members was that they were not understood because certain identities or experiences were focused above their broader experiences as queer migrants. This led some members to access different support systems according to the different identities they could elevate or pretend to have. The challenges in finding support that recognizes the intersectionality of experiences with domestic violence contributes to the invisibility of queer migrants that access support for DFV. So these are a few of the quotes, and through this section on findings, I'm going to be reading out some of these quotes that come directly from the participants on each of these issues. So, for example, you have to cosplay a certain thing so that they might help you, because if you say, I'm this, they won't take you seriously or won't listen to you. The minute that I'm an Arab woman, they say, oh, okay, yeah, is your husband a Muslim? Um, Another really powerful quote that I've included here is the second one is basically one of them said, I think there's a lot of code switching to even get a resource that will see you, understand you, and only one thing at a time can get dealt with. I just cosplayed being a straight cis woman and tried to be as white presenting as possible to get help. But as a result, so much was missed, and even then, I still couldn't get help. So also during these consultations, it wasn't just identifying the issues that they were finding when they're trying to get support. They were also providing recommendations on how to address them. And this, I understand, would be really important for our sector or people interested in supporting DFE in this cohort. Sorry, addressing DFE in this cohort. Some of the participants said that they should be looking at each of their matters as a case by case basis and resist the urge to quickly fit them into frameworks and resort to box ticking. And I guess what they mean by that is they felt that going to services, they felt like they had to, as they said, had to elevate a certain part of their identity so that they can get assistance. For example, that experience of being a cis woman, for example. So that participant felt that they had to really elevate that in order to get assistance for their problem, even if there was so much more going on that complicated their matters. They also recommended the need for support workers, sorry, to always remain curious and to always seek frequent clarification from them, as well as if there was capacity to provide ongoing education and exposure and relationship building with queer and migrant communities, and as a way to develop empathy and a more holistic understanding of the things that queer migrants have to go through. Um, they understood that this, they felt, would help us understand how domestic violence shows up in their cohort and how best to address them in consequence. So that was some information about intersectionality. And again, I do encourage you to check out the manual at the end of this presentation, as there'll be a lot more details as to this point, as well as the other points. Another really important point that came out of the consultations was a lot of discussion about communication styles, particularly around the expectation or the perception of being resilient when it comes to domestic family violence. So they understood that resilience was important, but most of them, or if not all of them, did think that it was something that masked underlying issues, or it could be something that is incorrectly perceived based on appearance. And given the cultural and language barriers present as well, that would make it more difficult to really gauge. So some of the members felt that they needed to be, as well as being resilient, they needed to be polite and graceful when under distress, while remaining vigilant to not appear aggressive or to not to feel like they um, um, didn't to feel. I'll rephrase that. It's a difficult thing to put into English. So basically, some members felt that they needed to be polite and graceful when under distress while remaining vigilant to not appear aggressive. And this reflects how, in their opinion, their perception, how white fragility operates in communication styles where they are discouraged from expressing vulnerability and communicating their issues authentically. And what that does is that it discourages the expression of what's really going on, and inhibits some support workers from identifying and thus addressing effectively domestic violence if it was occurring. So some of the things that they said on this point is, they told me because I was very well spoken, I can self-represent. You can write your own papers through your own initiative. I did my own affidavits. I did my own everything. Another one said, you can speak English, so I was referred to the DV service. They can only help with you with DV or family law. Then they helped with family law, and I did DV myself. So I got one appointment with the service. I went for 2 hours, and they said, you're more than equipped to be able to help yourself. So quotes such as this really speak to the pressure or the way in which some of this cohort feel when they go to services and feel like they can only be one thing. So it also speaks to intersectionality as well as on that point, but also this pressure to do everything on your own, even when you're struggling, confused and traumatized. I think this was a very major point of discussion and was quite emotive. I admit the frustrations that were coming out of this point in particular, but they did provide some recommendations. So practitioners can support clients to become resilient without dismissing them based on first impressions and appearances. There should be capacity to train, support, and prepare spaces for clients to express their stories, and so they're able to feel and express their vulnerability without feeling the pressure to not come off as aggressive, for example, or to have to appear or exercise resilience when it's very difficult to do so. They also also recommended that practitioners can learn different communication styles that do not reinforce oppression towards marginalized groups. For example, there was talk about how respectability politics can really hamper the authentic expression of experiences in this context. So those were some of the things that came out of recommendations as to resilience and those communication styles that came out through the project. Very similarly, we talked about language barriers and the pressure for them to use English, for example. But also, this section spoke a lot about interpreters and translations, and in particular, how some members, for one thing, felt uncomfortable requesting interpreters because it made them feel anxiety or shame, and they felt that they were inconveniencing the practitioners when asking for it. They also felt that they really had to highlight that some of these interpreters may not be safe for them. Interpreters sometimes had discriminatory attitudes towards them as queer. And as became very clear in the sharing of information, this puts significant risk on queer migrants as they could be outed and become a target of abuse in their communities. This was a very huge topic that was discussed during the consultations and is further elaborated in the manual. These are just two of the quotes. One time a service told me you can change the interpreter if you're not happy. When I changed the interpreter due to abusive behavior, the second interpreter was even worse, so I took home a new trauma. So that's an example. Recommendations as to this finding is potentially practitioners can be screened, or interpreters and translations can be screened for quality, to ensure as much as practicable community safety. And this could look like training or, training in basic terminology that relates to queer communities, but also training that would mean them undergoing regular exposure to community and building relationships in that way. It was also really important that for the members to say that they should have the ability to choose and decline interpreters at every stage of support where possible. Now, also, we talked quite a bit about how visible service providers are, and there was a lot of evaluation of services addressing domestic family violence. There was quite a consensus that, there was a lot of resources and the organizations that we mentioned, they didn't even know they existed. So this expressed a real barrier. But they also, some of them felt discouraged from accessing support even when they knew they existed. And that was because of several factors like language barriers or inconsistent communication from some services, as an example. So these are a couple of quotes. I'm just very conscious of time, so I might not read them now, but you can find these quotes in the manual. So some of the recommendations that they said on this point was maybe investing in diversifying communication methods, also trying to make a habit of reaching out to communities, such as organizations or private community groups where there are, potentially larger queer migrant affiliations. And as to accountability, practitioners should follow up on everyone who seeks help as quickly as possible. Although, as I imagine, that is an issue for many people accessing community legal centers and similar organizations. There was also a lot of discussion about whiteness and colonization and how the cohort felt pressured to fit into Western frameworks, and what they said to conform to certain norms and expectations in order to get support. And I already mentioned this previously. So quite a few of them felt that they had to really elevate certain identities, or they had to hide their non-binary identities, for example, and wanting to have to pass as a man or woman because of their ongoing and intergenerational experience under Western frameworks of gender, and how these Western frameworks address LGBTQ plus issues. So it's a very complicated point. I won't have much time to talk on that, but I'm willing to talk about that in the Q&A. Here are some of the quotes that were speaking about this topic. One of the most powerful ones is the second one. Are we asking for special treatment? No. There was quite a lot of passion about this point in the consultation, so I encourage you to read further on that in the manual. Some of the recommendations on this point was to always remain open and and to be curious on diverse truths and worldviews, and for practitioners to have capacity to be supported to commit to ongoing education and critical engagement when it comes to cultural differences. And lastly, the last major point was a review of resources. The cohort expressed the difficulties with readability and navigation of a lot of the fact sheets that we talked about. Some participants found that there was also a lack of intersectionality. So quite often resources about queer people often did not include information about cultural differences, while non-English resources lacked information about the queer community. So that was an issue. And those are a couple of quotes speaking to that. Um, so some of the recommendations were that resources on DFE should prioritize intersectionality, including examples of queer lives that are culturally specific. They also wanted to have community participation in the design of resources, a bit like the Queer Migrant Project. They also really emphasized the need for information to be simple, short, clear, and quick. And I bolded it for that reason, so that it's easier to understand and for multiple translations to exist as well. They also thought that diversifying resources was important. For example, there was an idea of having pocketbooks when helping clients one-on-one in the moment, as opposed to more extensive booklets for induction or training of employees, for example. And there was also quite a lot of talk about the need to use more inclusive terminology. Um, for example, the acronym LGBTQ+ does not always apply. So some of the outcomes of this project, so there's quite a lot of them, but the biggest outcome of this project was the creation of what we called the Safer Practice Guideline, which we called Manual for short, but the full name is the Manual for Liberatory Conscious Practice for Queer Migrants within the context of domestic and family violence in Queensland. So this is the manual that I've been referring to several times during this presentation. So I've included a QR code for you to quickly snap at, so you can get access to the electronic version. If for any reason you want to have the hard copy version, please reach out to us and I'm sure we'll be able to figure something out. So I'll leave maybe a few more seconds for anyone who wants to snap that. And we'll come back to that in the Q&A section if needed. So it's also on our website. If you navigate to our website, LGBTIlegalservice.org, and there is a very clear stamp called the Queer Migrant Project, you can access this manual there as well. So also at the end of the project, towards the end, sorry, we presented the manual and all of the findings as much as we could in a forum. We invited several domestic family violence stakeholders in Queensland and beyond to join in person at Multicultural Australia in Wollongabba, as well as joining the forum online. And this was an opportunity to seek feedback on the findings and to gather further insights in supporting queer migrants in the context of domestic family violence. So we had it was a very big day. We had guided group discussions of the themes found in the manual, and we also did a few activities on intersectionality. So at the start of the forum, we gave everyone each a piece of paper, two pieces of paper, basically a privileged self-assessment sheet, as well as a profile, which kind of apes the profiles we might find in a community legal center, gathering all those statistics. If you're an intake support, referral officer, you'll know what I mean. But the profile on the right was used in an activity that we did with the forum members, and basically we had all of the forum attendees line up in the hall. And the facilitators, me, Dilsa, and Sina, asked questions. And based on their profiles, they had to respond to those questions by either taking a step forward or taking a step back. So, for example, if Dilsa would say, if you live in a rural area, take a step back. Or if you've ever had to hide your identity because of your family or your culture or your broader community, take a step back. And if you live, for example, those are just a few examples. And what that did, it provided a very visceral experience as to the nature of disadvantage and as well as advantage and how we experience society together. Quite a lot of the feedback that we got from that activity was how each person compared each person in the room and how that made them feel. So it was a visceral example of the experience of intersectionality. Now, some of the forum members, this was some of their feedback. They felt that they're willing to look at their practices more critically and see where they might be able to change when it comes to queer migrant people. Um, so they also really importantly, they said they learned about the common experience of queer migrant people and that the forum gave them exactly the information they were finding. Obviously, these are one of the best quotes from that time, but there's so many other very positive responses as well. So we took the findings from the forum back to the peer advisor group in our last workshop, and they were generally very, very happy with the entirety of the project as well as the feedback they received from this forum. There was a particular emphasis on the fact that we had created a safe and inclusive space for them to feel included in. And these were some of the quotes that they expressed to us personally. You know, one of my favorite, um, you know, was that we shared lunch, games, and talking. We talked about our families. I feel free. I feel at home. You know, I want to emphasize just how important this project was to our members and as well as us as facilitators. It was a very powerful um, thing to come to the end of this project. And many of us were very sad that it was coming to an end, but it was very important work. And this is the one I was looking for. So one of them came up to us and said, every time that I'm here, I feel so good about myself and my community. It lifts my energy, and I take that with me going home and back into work. I'm not ready for this project to end. There's still work to be done. We've built something really special here. Whether this continues informally, whether we keep applying for funding, we still have work to do. So that comes to the last part, and I'm very good on time. Speaking on the impact of this project. What is the impact that this has already had? And didn't mention it previously, but last week, me, Dilsa, and Sana, we all went to NAM to present at the Queer Displacements Forum 2025 about the Queer Migrant Project. And obviously, I'm talking about the project here today. So, we're very open to the continuation of this work and to have, collaboration or even just discussion about the many findings that came out of it. So I really do encourage anyone who's interested in knowing more or any, opportunities to discuss this further, we'd be very happy to hear from that. So this is a picture of me and Dilsa and Sina at the forum the displacements conference last week. Um, yeah, particularly sassy one. Um, and I'm doing so good on time. I did it all within 50 minutes, Kate. Thank you so much for those who've listened. Um, it's a privilege and an honor to be expressing this work, and it it was the main request from the participants of the project to be able to disseminate and to continue the dialogue about what it means to be queer, what it means to be immigrant, and what it means to experience domestic family violence in the best ways or the better and safer ways in which to address these three intersections in Queensland. So thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your really thorough explanation of the project. If anyone has any questions for Mark, there is a Q&A box down the bottom of your control panel. So please feel free to pop them in there. But it's been really great as you've explained the project to then see throughout it how the participants' voices have been embedded, not just in your process, but then also even in this presentation now of saying this is this is what we're really trying to highlight, and just having all those quotes, I think is really powerful. Um, I'm just waiting to see if we have any questions that come through. If you think of any after the webinar as well, you're more than welcome to reach out to me and I can get in touch with Mark. And we'll also be sending out the recording and I can attach a copy of the manual to that email as well. So everyone who's registered will also get a copy of the manual. Um, yes, it looks like we may not have any questions at the moment. Mark, I'm just wondering, is there any of the quotes that
Yeah.
you went through previously that then you felt like, oh, I'm running out of time, but this was a really important point that
Ah,
that you couldn't
yeah.
explain in as much detail as you would have wanted to?
Yeah, look, all the quotes that I put on this presentation were kind of my favorite ones. As you can probably aware, there were so many of these quotes that I could have chosen for this this presentation. But I guess I didn't really look at some of the quotes about whiteness and the experiences of having to live in a Western framework and the pressures that come with that. It was during every workshop, this was a big topic that they frequently discussed, and I think it spoke to the safety that they felt to be able to express these thoughts and feelings, which they felt they couldn't after leaving the workshop. So we talked about the history and we talked about even the legal lens of, colonial laws coming into effect in countries like Singapore and how that was imposed on them for some centuries ago, and how that trickles into modern day Singapore. And there was a lot of talk about this sort of history, basically. And so we have an interesting quote by one of them talking about how Singaporeans feel that their traditional values were ones where they condemned homosexuality, for example, because they felt that that was part of their culture. But this person knows from their history and from their knowledge that that is probably not the case, or it's not as traditional as they may seem, these cultural norms. So the adoption, or maybe even the forced adoption of norms around gender and sexuality on people who aren't from the West, for example, that was quite a large talking point. Probably a very powerful quote was the second one on this page. Are we asking for special treatment? No. In the end of the day, I just want to be treated with dignity. I want people to respect my pronouns. I don't want to feel judged. All these things that services should be behaving with everyone. I want the same kind of kindness they show to cisgendered white people. So that kind of spoke to so the frustrations that they feel under what was identified as whiteness, or um, having to live in a Western framework. Now, I would, on this point, particularly encourage reading of the manual. I'm always saying this, go to the manual for details, because there's a lot of words dedicated to this subject that I don't think I can really do justice here. So I encourage to go and look at details on that in particular. But as for other ones that I might have bypassed, um, I also um, just wanted to speak about one of them. So I didn't include quite a lot of points about intersectionality just because I wanted to squeeze it into this presentation. But this notion of code switching was also something that came up a lot. This need to feel like they had to become someone or to act, or the word was used as cosplay. That was just the word that they used in that they adopted in the consultations to express how they felt that they had to elevate a certain identity of selves or even pretend. That was a really important finding to express, and which really emphasized the point that intersectionality is really important when it comes to being more accessible to this cohort. So I guess that's some things on that. Um,
Mark, I
I
might just
guess,
jump
yeah,
in because we have
sure.
got a couple of questions, and I was
Oh,
thinking that
okay.
point about code switching might actually fit quite well with one of the ones we've just got. So this
Yeah.
person said, "Thank you for the incredible presentation. I know the focus of the project was in the experience of queer migrants as DFE clients, but do you think any of the insights are transferable to discussions of our queer migrant workforce?"
Um, so in term, if I can just Kate, just clarify that question. Do you mean
Mm,
um transferable in terms of the queer migrant workforce without domestic violence attached, or um
I believe so. I think that's how I've read it, as far as more broadly for people who are queer from migrant backgrounds,
yeah,
how much of this
of
could then be
course.
transferred to them, particularly if they're either working in our centres or working in other places beyond just the experience of being a client.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, so much for those who, for people who haven't experienced domestic family violence or don't fit into all three of those intersections, this would be very useful, and particularly for practitioners of domestic family violence who are assisting those in these three intersections. But look, so much the thing about the framework of intersectionality is that it can apply to so many experiences. When we think of intersectionality, we think about how identities overlap or how experiences overlap with each other to compound certain advantages or disadvantages. So when you look at it like that, it certainly is transferable. All of this is transferable to the experiences of many people. Although it might be a bit there might be a bit of a stretch trying to extend that to people who aren't migrants, but it's all transferable when you look at it in the lens of intersectionality. As for practitioners, yeah, this would certainly be relevant to their practices, and I would hope so. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mark. And just mindful of time, I was just this one last question. It says that they're looking forward to reading the manual and asking questions, and they're wondering if there's a service that can educate DFE services about third queer culture specifically.
Yeah, so Third Queer Culture is part of QPAST. If gosh, maybe I can send you the link to that organization. QPAST is the organization that Sina works from. If you're interested in Third Queer Culture, how they relate to this project or beyond, I would encourage you to access their website. I can also, if you wanted to. Um, I could provide details of Signer's details to you, or you can provide me your details, and I can pass them on to Signer. They would be the best person to speak on third queer culture. But as for the creation of third queer culture as a kind of empowerment of those in the of two intersections of being queer and of being immigrants, um, yeah, so much of this project applies, and I would encourage you to read the manuals on that point. But if you want to, I can connect you with Sina. Mm.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your expertise and all your learnings from this project. It's been really great to learn more about it. Before everyone goes today, I'll just remind you that there'll be a feedback survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar as you close it. And we'll also be sending out the recording later today, as well as a link to the manual itself. We hope to see you at the next CLCQ webinar, and thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you.